The Great Deception. Washington, DCLXVI. Revelation 13:18, New International Version. 18 This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Introduction. In the speculative engineering layer. You do not see the cage when you are born inside the machinery. For generations, the populace has been fed a highly sanitized, low-resolution feed of their own reality. You are taught to view history as a series of random political shifts and architecture, as mere aesthetic choices. You are handed physical currency and told it has value. You stare at the broadcast monitors and accept the telemetry as news. But the surface is just a user interface, designed specifically to keep the meat space nodes distracted while the true operating system hums quietly in the dark. This text is a hard fork from the official narrative. Welcome to the speculative engineering layer. What follows is a decryption key for the Great Deception. We are going to bypass the public relations firewall and examine the source code of the Republic. When you strip away the patriotic theater, you are left with the cold, hard numerology of a control grid. It is a system built by architects, who understood that if you encode your dogma into the very pavement, the citizens walk on. And print your gods in the microscopic margins of the fiat they trade. You never need to point a gun at them. They will police themselves. The chapters ahead map the circuitry of this occult infrastructure. We will trace the predator geometry carved into the street-level macro board of Washington DCLXVI. We will measure the true, unredacted dimensions of the monuments, translating the physical obelisks back into their baseline hex code. We will follow the untethered, floating phantom of the dollar to the biological Faraday cage of the Bohemian Grove, where the operators of the machine ritualistically air-gap their own empathy. Finally, we will deconstruct the alphanumeric pacification protocols, broadcast directly into the living rooms of the American sprawl. The elite didn't hide their signatures, they embedded them in plain sight. They rely on your cognitive dissonance to dismiss the pareidolia, the repeating integers, and the ancient symbols as mere coincidence. But in the architecture of total spectrum dominance, there are no coincidences. There is only the grid. Consider this an optical upgrade. Once you read the code, you can never look at the static the same way again. Boot up. Chapter 1, The Owl Hill. The sky above the district was the color of a monitor tuned to a dead channel, but the meat space grid below was strictly by the numbers. Government-sanctioned geometry isn't something you see from the street, down where the lobbyists and data runners scramble through the smog. You have to get orbital, looking down through the static to see the shape of the predator carved into the Capitol's concrete sprawl. They built a grand illusion, a great deception mapped directly into the earth. The streets themselves trace the outline of the hill owl. It wasn't just urban planning, it was a physical circuit board for the occult. They stamped their code right into the map. Washington DCLXVI. The ancients had a number for the beast, and the architects encoded it into the very pavement the masses walk on, broadcasting a localized frequency of 666. But the real glitch is in the fiat currency. Pull a physical note from your pocket, if you're still archaic enough to carry paper, and look closely at the upper right quadrant. Amidst the intricate weaving, microscopic and nesting in the margins, is the great owl of Bohemia. They hide their gods in the fractal webbing of the money. It's a systemic control loop, scaling up from the pocket lint of the street-level hustle, all the way to coordinates 38.4647 degree north, 122.9933 degree west. That's where the geometric grid truly terminates, deep in the Californian redwoods, sitting quietly at the edge of the Lake of Moloch. This is the baseline reality of the Republic, a system of control woven into the architecture and printed on the cache, waiting for someone with the right optics to finally parse the data. Chapter 2, The Hexagonal Meat Cage. The obelisk is a spike of dead Egyptian firmware jammed straight into the Potomac mud, acting as the central grounding pin for the entire district. From the street, the tourists stare up at the marble needle, blissfully digesting the public relations packet. They are fed the surface-level telemetry, 555.5 feet tall, 55.5 feet wide at the base, a clean, repeating decimal. It feels stable. It feels monumental. But the architects of the Great Deception didn't code in feet. If you want to read the source code of the Republic, you have to drop down to the baseline resolution of the builders. You have to measure it in inches. Run the conversion, and the optical illusion shatters. 555.5 becomes exactly 6,666 inches of vertical dominance. The base locks into the grid at exactly 666 inches wide. It isn't a monument, it's a broadcast tower, radiating a very specific numerical frequency over the owl-shaped circuitry of the Capitol street-level macroboard. They didn't hide the decryption key, either. They left it in plain sight, an archaic README file bundled in the terminal of the ancient world. Revelation 13:18. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. It isn't prophecy, it's a schematic. To understand the grid, you have to understand the binary weight of the number 6. In the old texts, the source code of Genesis, humanity was compiled on the 6th day. 6 is the number of the hominid, the flesh, the terrestrial bound. It is the integer of human striving that perpetually falls short of the 7th day. The holy prime, the state of rest and divine perfection. 6 is the state of being trapped in the material layer. But it's in the geometry where the trap truly tightens. Zoom in past the concrete and the lobbyists, down to the molecular lattice. Carbon-12 is the base element of all known organic life. The meat space you inhabit is built entirely on a foundation of 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. You are mathematically bound to the beast just by drawing breath. In geometry, 6 forms the hexagon, the tightest, most structurally efficient packing arrangement in a two-dimensional plane. It is nature's perfect prison cell, locking together without gaps, without escape vectors. The honeycomb, the basalt columns. The North Pole of Saturn, the hex, is the shape of inescapable, efficient control. The obelisk stands in the center of the owl's gaze as a geometric assertion. By encoding the 666 into the physical dimensions of the nation's axis mundi, the architects weren't just flexing their occult cryptography, they were establishing a resonant frequency. They were declaring that the system is closed, entirely material, and perfectly engineered to keep the carbon-based units locked firmly into the grid. Chapter 3, The Avian Protocol and the Empathy Air Gap. The owl is not a mascot of wisdom. That is the PR spin, the sanitized README file fed to the public nodes. In the raw, unfiltered source code of the architects, the owl is an apex predator built for the dark. It possesses asymmetrical hearing to isolate the rustle of prey, and serrated feathers to ensure its strike is entirely silent. It is the perfect sigil for a surveillance state. It sees you in the shadows, and you never hear it coming. They stamped this nocturnal hunter into the macro architecture of the Capitol grid, but a control system needs a transmission medium to reach the local level. It needs to infect the pocket of every citizen. The hack was elegant. First, they had to sever the silver tether. As long as currency was tied to a physical metal dug from the dirt, it had intrinsic weight. It was bound to the laws of thermodynamics. So, they snipped the hard line. They untethered the dollar from the physical world and migrated it into the cloud of pure, weaponized theater fiat currency, a consensual hallucination backed by nothing but state violence and occult cryptography. Once the money became pure symbol, they embedded the microscopic owl into the intricate webbing of the $1 note, a fractal predator nesting in the upper right quadrant, watching every transaction, every exchange of energy in the meat space economy. But symbols require maintenance. The men who operate the levers of this machinery, the CEOs, the media barons, the elected officials who masquerade as public servants, carry a vulnerability. The human meat sack is pre-installed with an empathy subroutine. It's an evolutionary glitch that makes you care about the society you govern. If you are going to run a global machine that grinds up human capital for profit, you have to periodically wipe that hard drive. Every July, the Apex node operators disconnect from the DC and Wall Street grids and migrate to a heavily encrypted patch of Northern California redwoods, the Bohemian Grove. It is an analog retreat, a boys' club for the masters of the universe, anchored by a 40-foot concrete owl perched on the edge of a body of water, officially mapped as the Lake of Moloch. Here, They run the ultimate psychological defragmentation cycle, the cremation of care. Under the canopy of ancient trees, cloaked in robes that mock the very idea of a democratic republic, they engage in high-production psychodrama. They float an effigy of a child, a proxy for innocence, a stand-in for the vulnerable masses they were elected to protect across the dark water to the foot of the great owl. They call the effigy dull care. As the mock sacrifice is burned before the altar of Moloch, the hidden speakers pump out the synthesized screams of the child. It is theater, yes, but it is applied psychological formatting. By cheering the immolation of the screaming effigy, they are ritualistically murdering their own capacity for compassion. They are air-gapping their conscience. The fire burns away the care of societal obligation. When they leave the redwoods and plug back into the mainframe on Monday morning, their empathy subroutines have been fully uninstalled, leaving them optimized, cold, and perfectly aligned with the ruthless geometry of the machine. Chapter 4: The Fiat Phantom and the Deprecated God. The official patch notes issued to the public are always insultingly simple. They tell the street-level nodes that it's just a smudge, an artifact of the printing process, a microscopic ink spill in the upper right quadrant of the $1 note. They blame your wetware, calling it pareidolia, a glitch in the human optical processor that makes you see faces in the static and owls in the noise. But anyone with a baseline understanding of the system knows the Bureau of Engraving doesn't do random. You don't build the control codes for a global financial empire and accidentally leave a typo in the main executable. Every micron of green ink, every interwoven line of that fractal webbing, is deliberate architecture. The predator isn't an accident, it's a root-level signature. The update rolled out in the 1960s. That was the decade they initiated the hard fork of the American reality. They severed the silver tether, physically unplugging the baseline economy from the earth. Silver had a resonant frequency, a grounding metric tied to the physical laws of thermodynamics. When they snapped that hard line, the dollar was no longer backed by anything you could weigh or hold. It became pure fiat, a consensual hallucination sustained entirely by state violence, media bandwidth, and the carefully curated theater of the evening news. The moment the silver vanished, the true theology of the grid was swapped out in the dark. The text on the paper might still offer lip service to the divine, but the operating system of the Federal Reserve doesn't run on the ancient, covenant code of YHWH. The tetragrammaton was quietly deprecated, replaced by the silent watcher in the margins. The new god of the terminal is a hungry, nocturnal thing. Once the currency was decoupled from reality, the architects had a blank check to hack the human substrate directly. If money is just a shared belief, then the minds and hearts of the public become the only real collateral left. The screens, the broadcasts, the endless loops of manufactured political theater, it's all just infrastructure designed to capture human processing power. We are tethered to a system of occult geometry that we are forced to carry in our own pockets, a predatory loop of systemic control, operating just beneath the threshold of conscious perception. They flooded the zone with noise and flashing lights, engineering the matrix to keep the populace permanently locked in a low-level state of dread. They made us terrified of the dark, keeping our eyes glued to the artificial glow, entirely unaware that the dark is exactly where the owl was built to hunt. Chapter 5: The 1933 Handshake in the Faraday Canopy. Apex predators rarely hunt alone. They build mesh networks in the dark, routing their power through encrypted, meat-space protocols where the public nodes can't track the packet data. You don't construct a control grid across a continent without establishing a secure server to run the beta tests. Check the timestamps in the system logs. The sanitized history feeds will tell you the Bohemian Club was established earlier. But the true architecture of the Grove, the modern, weaponized iteration of the retreat locked into the grid in 1933. It wasn't a random fiscal quarter. In the European sector, the sky over Berlin was choked with the smoke of the Reichstag fire. The arson was a masterpiece of political theater, a false flag engineered to flip a democratic republic into a totalitarian mainframe overnight. The synchronization of the Grove's elite consolidation and the European burn wasn't coincidence. In the high-stakes cryptography of the global architects, there are no coincidences. It was a transatlantic handshake, a deliberate signal broadcast on a frequency only the initiated could hear. The redwoods of Northern California operate as a biological Faraday cage. Under that massive, ancient canopy, the signals of the outside world, the media optics, the public accountability, the democratic illusions are entirely blocked. It is a blackout zone where the ideological black market thrives. It's where the autocrats, the far-right string pullers, and the architects of deeply unpopular dogmas gather to compile their code. Out in the daylight, they play the roles of moderates and philanthropists. In the shadows of the grove, shielded by the owl, they run the raw, unpatched versions of their true operating systems. And then there is the transmission code itself, 1933. To the street-level user, it's just a date. But to the operators of the machine, it's a coordinate on the 33 grid. 33 is the master frequency of the Masonic architecture, the highest degree of clearance in the occult hierarchy. By syncing the activation of their Pacific Rim power center with the 1933 European collapse, they weren't just marking time, they were throwing the master switch. They were hardwiring the American shadow state into the global architecture of control, signaling to the rest of the elite that the grid was finally live, and the trap was permanently set. Chapter 6, The Vulpine Broadcast and the Pythagorean Hack. The terminal phase of the operation didn't require kinetic strikes, it required bandwidth. When the architects needed a mainline directly into the visual cortex of the populace, they didn't rely on subtlety, they went for total optical saturation. Walk the concentric rings of the Pentagon, past the black ice servers and the secured tactical nodes, and you'll find the screens, bank after bank of monitors, tuned 24/7 to the officially sanctioned feed, the Vulpine Network, Fox. To the untrained eye, it looks like a continuous, high-definition scroll of manufactured outrage, red, white and blue graphics, and political theater. But to those with the right decryption keys, mapping the underlying architecture of the grid, it's a pure, unadulterated pacification protocol, a mockery of truth, weaponized and broadcast at scale. You have to look at the alphanumeric root code. The builders of this system are deeply attached to their numerological signatures, always wrapping their psychological payloads in the archaic syntax of gematria. Run the standard English alphabet through a basic Pythagorean reduction cipher. F is the 6th letter of the sequence. O is the 15th, 1 plus 5 yields 6. X is the 24th, 2 plus 4, another 6. FOX, 666. They packaged the ancient integer of the beast as a prime-time cable network, and hardwired it into every flat screen in the sprawl. It isn't a random corporate moniker cooked up by a marketing committee. It is a deliberately encoded sigil, a non-random hex placed right out in the open domain, camouflaged by the glare of the studio lights and the loud suits of the anchors. By tuning the nerve center of the military-industrial complex to this exact frequency, the architects synchronize the government's operational reality with the public's consensual hallucination. The populace sits mesmerized in their living rooms, bathed in the glow of the cathode and the LED, consuming the broadcast. They remain entirely unaware that the low-level dread they feel isn't organic. It's a calculated algorithm, a steady drip of hex data keeping the meat space nodes paralyzed, while the great machine quietly continues its work in the dark. Alternatively, Part 2. You can free your own mind. They seem to think that there is a war on illegal drugs, and yet that is complete fiction. The so-called war on drugs is not a war on pills, powder, plants, and potions. It is war on mental states, a war on consciousness itself, how much, what sort we are permitted to experience, and who gets to control it. More than an unintentional misnomer, the government-termed war on drugs is a strategic decoy label, a sleight of hand move by government to redirect attention away from what lies at ground zero of the war, each individual's fundamental right to control his or her own consciousness. It should be noted that drug laws do not control drugs. They control the actions of people in a manner resembling the Catholic Index Librorum Prohibitorum, and its prohibition of the printing of forbidden thought catalysts, aka books. Illegal drugs do not exist, and it is this very notion that objects are illegal that enslaves us by creating the idea of an indivisible evil, in truth a reversal of subject and object of legal regulation, that negates all possibility of what they say they want to achieve, regulation, albeit they still think it's about regulating drugs, when it is about regulating persons. Richard Glenn Boyer, Journal of Cognitive Liberties, Summer 2000. Chapter 7. The Wetware Patch and the Schedule 1 Kryptonite. There is a backdoor in the architecture, a physical patch for the meat space grid, hiding in plain sight. You can free your own mind, but you have to understand the nature of the firewall they built to keep you contained. The apex nodes, the owls, didn't just map the concrete sprawl, they hacked the atomic baseline. They engineered the splitting of the atom, a brute force trauma to the foundation of reality, just to prove they held the administrative keys to life and death. And while the populace was mesmerized by the blinding flash of the mushroom cloud, the architects quietly threw a blackout curtain over the sky. They scrubbed the radar telemetry, they classified the silent, supermassive architectures drifting through the Pacific clouds and buried the data on the drones observing our silos. They locked down UFO disclosure, because a species looking up at the infinite is a species that stops looking down at its chains. But the atom and the saucer were just hardware. The true battlefield was always the human wetware. If you want to maintain total spectrum dominance over a population, you don't just police their streets, you police their internal frequencies. The most expansive global conflict of the modern era isn't fought with kinetic weapons. It's the Prohibition Protocol, the war on drugs. It was never about public health. It was a targeted, systemic suppression of a specific biological decryption key. Schedule 1. They took delta-9-THC, a botanical compound with a zero mortality baseline, and classified it as the ultimate threat to the state. Why? Because the plant is absolute kryptonite to the nocturnal control grid. The owls operate on the frequency of fear, scarcity, and compliance. Delta-9 acts as a molecular tuner, shifting the human receiver away from the static of the broadcast and aligning it with the archaic, resonant frequency of the Christ consciousness. It dissolves the artificial ego constructs the system relies on. A daily ritual, the slow burn of the flower, the concentrated calibration of a heavy oil, the golden, soporific drop of a honey tincture sliding under the tongue is not an narcotic escape. It is an act of neurological defiance. It is a user manually overriding the system's dampeners to access an expanded bandwidth of empathy and awareness. The ancients had the source code. Excavate the data from the deep past, back to the sun-baked temples of the Levant, and you find the residue baked into the altars. The early Israelites didn't just stumble upon it, it was the sacred anointing oil. They bathed their priests in the resin of the plant, utilizing the botanical tech to interface directly with the divine. The modern architects knew that if that frequency re-emerged at scale, the grid would collapse, the empathy air gap would close. So, they outlawed the very biology of awakening. They built a cage around consciousness itself, hoping we would forget that the key to shattering the great deception is, and always has been, growing quietly in the dirt. Chapter 8. The Transdermal Firewall and the YHWH Hardline. The ancient pastoral zones were not the sanitized, idyllic landscapes the Sunday school feeds project. They were gritty, high-stakes survival grids. To the archaic shepherd, the flock wasn't just livestock, it was a network of vulnerable biological nodes, constantly under threat from airborne malware. The vector of attack was a parasitic insect, a predatory winged glitch that would seek out the auditory ports of the sheep, laying its malicious code deep inside the ear canal. Left unchecked, the eggs would hatch, the corruption would spread, and the hardware would crash. It was a fatal, agonizing system failure. The countermeasure wasn't a prayer, it was applied botanical engineering. The shepherds deployed a heavy, viscous firewall. They coated the cranial plating of the sheep in a thick layer of olive oil. The parasites couldn't penetrate the physical substrate, and the neural integrity of the herd was maintained. But the sysadmins of the ancient world, the priests, the kings, the prophets understood that this protective protocol could be ported over to the human operating system. You can find the raw schematic, unencrypted, in the source text of Exodus 30:22-33. It outlines the precise formulation for an administrative-level anointing oil, the core executable in the formula, cannabosum, the fragrant cane, cannabis. This wasn't mere ritual theatre, it was transdermal pharmacology, a percutaneous patch applied directly to the crown of the head, whether rendered as a heavy topical oil, combusted into the lungs, or refined into a golden honey tincture to be absorbed beneath the tongue. The botanical tech functioned with the same disruptive efficiency. The oil bypassed the blood-brain barrier, seeping through the skin to run a root-level update on the user's wetware. The effect was a binary upgrade, highly protective and intensely psychotropic. First, it shielded the mind, creating a cognitive Faraday cage against the ambient psychological malware of fear, scarcity, and external control. It prevented the parasitic ideologies of the material world from taking root in the psyche. Secondly, and most dangerously to the modern architects of the Great Deception, it exponentially widened the user's bandwidth. The psychotropic expansion wasn't a hallucination, it was a calibration. It tuned the human receiver away from the low-frequency static of the material plane, and established a direct, zero-latency hardline to the original, uncorrupted architect of the system. It opened a secure, two-way communication channel with the god of the ancient desert, YHWH. The owls of the modern grid understand this mechanism perfectly. They didn't criminalize the plant because it causes system degradation. They classified it as a Schedule 1 threat because it is the ultimate decryption key. They locked away the cannabosum because a population that can manually reboot its own consciousness, shield its mind from parasitic data, and patch directly into the divine mainframe can never be kept in the dark. Chapter 9. The Christus Protocol and the Redacted Canon. The religious dogma of the modern era is a heavily sanitized operating system. It was compiled by the architects of the Great Deception, to keep the populace worshipping the interface rather than accessing the source code. They built a firewall of rigid theology around the historical avatar of Jesus, stripping him of the botanical technology that made his network run. But the original developers left a backdoor in the text, an open-source disclaimer for all the undocumented features and unrecorded patches. You can find it in the final lines of the system logs. John 21:25, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. It is the ultimate blank check for the speculative engineer. It shatters the orthodox firewall, allowing us to bypass the dogma and look at the raw, historical hardware. Start with the title. The public nodes treat Christ like a surname, a biological inheritance. It isn't. In the Greek root language, the word is Christus. It is a verb, a methodology, a technical designation. It translates literally to the anointed, the one covered in oil. To be the Christus was not merely a spiritual state, it was a physical, pharmacological process. It meant saturating the meat space hardware in the heavy, transdermal cannabosum extracts. To seek the Christ consciousness is to actively apply the patch, utilizing the botanical oil to manually override the hardwired, hex code static of the 666 grid. It is the application of the ultimate cryptographic shield. The historical coordinates align perfectly. The avatar Jesus spawned from the tribal server of Judah. If you want to know what protocols the Judahite network ran in its original, uncorrupted state, you have to dig into the physical memory of the desert. When archaeologists ran a deep scan on the ancient shrine at Tel Arad, a primary Judahite temple, they didn't just find stone, they found the chemical residue of the hack. The altars were coated in it. The ancient priests were actively burning the botanical tech, using the psychotropic smoke to open a zero-latency channel to the divine. This wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the original terms of service. In Genesis 1:29, the root-level sysadmin granted absolute permissions. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth. The user was given full administrative access to the botanical wetware. So how did the modern grid convince the populace that the key was poison? They patched the book. When the early imperial councils compiled the official, canonical release of the Bible, they ran a massive deletion protocol. They scrubbed the apocryphal files. In those hidden, redacted directories, explicitly removed from the public servers, lies the one direct, undeniable reference to hemp. The architects deleted the manual, outlawed the Christus oil, and trapped the human receiver in the dark, hoping we would never figure out how to turn the receiver back on. Conclusion. The manual override. You don't feel the bars of a cage when you are born already compiled into its memory. We drop into this meat space entirely unawares, spawning into a system that was rigged against us centuries before our first breath. But the human substrate isn't entirely numb. Deep in our primitive firmware, we can sense the perimeter. We brush up against the cold, hard edges of the occult geometry, and it terrifies us. The sheer scale of the deception triggers a low-frequency dread. So, we optimize for survival. We keep our heads down, run our daily routines, and pay our tithes in their phantom fiat, desperately hoping the predator in the margins never turns its gaze directly upon us. We live quietly, functionally enslaved by the very architecture this manual has mapped out. The obelisks, the grids, the broadcast hexes, they form a perfect, invisible panopticon. But the absolute, uncompromising truth of the speculative engineering layer is this: the system is not impenetrable. The architects of this control grid lie permanently biased toward suspicion of their own populace, because they know a fatal flaw exists in their design. They could not patch out the botanical hardline. The decryption key is readily available. It grows in the dirt, vibrating at the ancient Christus frequency that the 666 grid cannot suppress. But you have to execute the command yourself. There is no white hat savior coming down from the cloud to sever your tethers. No disclosure from the alphabet agencies. No mass awakening scheduled to be broadcast on the Vulpine networks. If you want to air gap your mind from their parasitic data, you have to be the one to strike the match, apply the oil, and initiate the reboot. You are the only one who can free your own wetware. This text is not your salvation. It is merely a compromised data packet, a smuggled schematic of the prison's floor plan. It is only the start of the hack. The path is illuminated, the back door is wide open, but you are the one who has to pull the plug and walk out of the dark.